Rome's 5 fatal flaws that ended an empire. The Roman Empire, the very name, conjures images of power, order, and civilization. For 1,000 years, it was the ancient world's undisputed superpower. Its legions seemed invincible, its engineering remade landscapes, and its legal codes became the bedrock of Western civilization. From the sun-baked deserts of Syria to the rain-swept shores of Britain, 1/3 of all humanity lived under the Roman eagle. It was an empire of such staggering might and sophistication that for many, it seemed destined to last forever. It was, to them, eternal. So how did it all come crashing down? How did this monumental, world-spanning civilization, the greatest the world had ever known, shatter into a million pieces? It wasn't one single event, not one battle or one terrible emperor. The fall of Rome was a slow, agonizing unraveling, a collapse driven by a series of catastrophic, interlocking failures. These weren't just simple mistakes, they were fatal flaws, deep cracks in the very foundations of the empire. So let's explore the 5 fatal flaws that brought the world's mightiest empire to its knees. Fatal flaw number 1, political instability, the rot from within. Every great structure that falls starts to decay from the inside, and Rome was no exception. The first, and perhaps most destructive flaw, was a plague of political instability that gnawed at the heart of the empire for centuries. In its golden age, the empire was often defined by strong, effective leaders like Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius. But that stability was paper-thin. Rome never developed a clear, constitutional system for transferring power. There was no undisputed line of succession. This flaw created a recurring power vacuum nearly every time an emperor died. A vacuum that ambitious generals and ruthless politicians were all too happy to fill with violence. This simmering problem boiled over into a full-blown catastrophe during the crisis of the 3rd century. In the chaotic 49-year period between 235 and 284 AD, the empire nearly tore itself apart. During that half-century, at least 26 men were officially recognized as emperor, with countless other usurpers. Almost all of them were assassinated, overthrown in coups, or killed in battle fighting other Romans. Just think about that. A new emperor, on average, every 2 years, each one rising to power through bloodshed and civil war. Power wasn't earned through statesmanship. It was seized by the man with the biggest army and the fewest morals. This era of so-called barracks emperors turned the leadership of the known world into a deadly game of musical chairs. Generals abandoned their posts on the frontiers, marching their legions not against Rome's enemies, but against each other. The consequences were devastating. The government was paralyzed. Widespread corruption became the norm as officials, assuming they wouldn't be in power for long, focused on enriching themselves. Why plan for the future of the empire when your own future was likely measured in months? Public trust vanished. State resources were squandered, and the very idea of a unified Roman state began to crumble. And that rot, that instability at the very top, started to poison everything else. With no one truly at the helm, the economic engine of the empire began to sputter and die. Fatal flaw number 2, economic catastrophe. The empire goes broke. An empire runs on soldiers and money. As Rome's political world descended into chaos, its economy followed right behind it, creating our second fatal flaw, a catastrophic economic meltdown. For centuries, Rome's economy had been fueled by conquest. New territories meant new slaves, new gold, and new lands to tax. But when the empire largely stopped expanding around the 2nd century, that fire hose of new wealth was shut off. An over-reliance on slave labour had also stifled innovation, and as the supply of enslaved people dried up, the massive agricultural estates, the latifundia, faced a severe labour crisis. emperors still needed vast sums of money to fund the bloated military, pay off political allies, and stage lavish games to keep the urban populace from rioting. Their solution was a disaster. They started watering down their money. Imagine you have a bottle of pure orange juice. To make it go further, you start adding water. At first, no one notices, but soon you're just selling orange-coloured water. That's exactly what emperors did to their coins. The main silver coin, the denarius, was the backbone of Roman commerce. Under Augustus, it was almost pure silver. But subsequent emperors, desperate for cash, began mixing it with cheaper metals like copper. By the middle of the 3rd century, the denarius contained only about 5% silver. Eventually, it was just a bronze coin with a thin silver wash. People weren't fooled. They knew the money was worthless, which led to runaway inflation. Prices for everyday goods skyrocketed, rising by an estimated 1,000% or more in the 3rd and 4th centuries. In a spectacular display of economic ignorance, the government made things even worse. They imposed crushing taxes, often demanding payment not in their own worthless coins, but in goods and produce. This annihilated the merchant and farming classes. Trade networks that had once spanned the continent fell apart. People fled the cities to return to subsistence farming, hoping to escape the tax collectors' grasp. The Roman government had essentially poisoned its own well. It destroyed its currency, taxed its people into poverty, and dismantled the very trade that made it rich. A broke, politically fractured empire now faced its next great challenge: defending impossibly long borders with an army it could no longer afford. Fatal flaw number 3. A military on the brink. Overstretched and outsourced. The Roman legion is the stuff of legend, a symbol of discipline, engineering, and raw power that conquered a world. But by the late Empire, the once mighty Roman army was a shadow of its former self. This is our 3rd fatal flaw, a military decline born from overextension and a dangerous reliance on foreign soldiers. The Roman Empire was enormous. Its borders stretched for thousands of miles, from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. Just patrolling this frontier was a monumental and cripplingly expensive task. The constant need for defence, combined with endless civil wars, meant military spending consumed the lion's share of the budget. This diverted funds from essential infrastructure like roads, which, ironically, made it harder for the army to move quickly. Worse than the cost, though, was the manpower shortage. Centuries of war, declining birth rates, and devastating plagues meant there simply weren't enough Roman citizens to fill the ranks. Desperate, the government turned to outsiders to fight its battles. The army began to recruit heavily from the very barbarian tribes it was meant to be fighting: Goths, Franks, Vandals, and other Germanic peoples. These foreign soldiers, known as foederati, were often granted land within the empire in exchange for military service. On the surface, it seemed like a clever solution, but it was a deal with the devil. These soldiers often had little loyalty to the abstract idea of Rome. Their allegiance was to their paymaster and their own tribal leaders, not to a distant emperor. They lacked the iron discipline that had made the classical legions so formidable. This barbarization of the military meant the army became less and less Roman in character, equipment, and loyalty. Imagine your home security system being run by the same people who have been trying to break in. It's a disaster waiting to happen. Roman generals, often of barbarian descent themselves, now commanded armies of men who had more in common with Rome's enemies than with Roman citizens. These armies were unreliable and frequently turned on their employers. The very institution designed to protect the empire had become one of its greatest sources of instability. It was an overstretched, underfunded, and dangerously outsourced force. And just as the walls were being guarded by foxes, a tidal wave of new threats was gathering on the horizon. Fatal flaw number 4. Barbarian invasions. The floodgates break. With a corrupt government, a ruined economy, and a compromised military, the Roman Empire was a giant on feet of clay. The fourth fatal flaw delivered the final violent blows. Relentless waves of invasions. For centuries, Rome had been the predator, not the prey, but the balance of power was shifting. The Barbarians, a Roman catch-all for the diverse groups living beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers, were becoming more numerous, more organised, and more aggressive. The pressure mounted in the late 4th century with the arrival of a terrifying new force from the east, the Huns. Their westward migration created a domino effect, pushing tribes like the Goths up against the Roman frontier, seeking refuge in massive numbers. In 376 AD, the Romans allowed a huge group of Visigoths to cross the Danube, hoping to recruit them as soldiers. But corrupt Roman officials brutally mistreated them, and Ammianus Marcellinus, a contemporary historian, recorded stories of them trading dog meat to the starving Goths in exchange for their children as slaves. Desperate and furious, the Goths revolted. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378, a Gothic army completely annihilated a Roman army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens. It was a staggering, unprecedented defeat. The idea of Roman invincibility was shattered. This was the beginning of the end. The border had been breached, and the floodgates were open. Sensing weakness, other tribes poured across the frontiers. In 406, a huge coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine and rampaged through Gaul and Spain. The heartland of the empire was no longer safe. Then, in 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The city of Rome, the eternal city that hadn't been taken by a foreign enemy in 800 years, was sacked by the Visigoths under their king Alaric. While the physical damage was not catastrophic, the psychological blow was. The aura of invincibility was gone forever. As St. Jerome wrote from Bethlehem, the city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. Just a few decades later, in 455, the city was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. The Western Roman Empire was now in a death spiral, its provinces carved up into barbarian kingdoms. The final, almost ceremonial blow came in 476 AD. The Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needed an emperor. The invasions weren't the sole cause of the fall, but they were the executioners of an empire already dying from 1,000 internal cuts. Fatal flaw number 5. Invisible enemies. Plague and climate change. Corruption, economic ruin, military decay, and invasions are the classic culprits for Rome's fall. But our final flaw is one that historians are only now beginning to fully appreciate: a series of environmental and public health disasters. Rome's rise had coincided with an unusually stable and favourable period of weather, known as the Roman climatic optimum. For centuries, the Mediterranean world was generally warm, wet, and predictable, producing the bountiful harvests needed to support a large population and a massive army. The climate was, in a way, Rome's silent partner. But beginning in the mid-2nd century, that partner turned hostile. The climate started to shift, becoming more erratic and cooler. After 450 AD, this intensified into what scientists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age. This period of climatic instability led to crop failures, food shortages, and famine across the empire. An empire already struggling to feed its people was pushed closer to the brink by forces entirely beyond its control. As the climate soured, another invisible killer emerged. The very things that made Rome a powerhouse, its dense cities and continent-spanning trade networks, also made it the perfect incubator for disease. The empire was rocked by a series of devastating pandemics. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, erupted in 165 AD and raged for 15 years. It killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people, including the Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself. Then, in the mid-3rd century, at the height of the political crisis, the plague of Cyprian struck, causing widespread death and social breakdown. These pandemics had a catastrophic impact. They killed farmers, soldiers, administrators, and taxpayers by the millions, creating acute labor shortages and crippling the economy. The army, desperate for recruits, was decimated. The population of the empire, which may have peaked at around 70 million, went into a steep decline. Urban centers became death traps. These invisible enemies acted as a terrible multiplier for all of Rome's other problems. A government weakened by corruption was powerless against famine. An economy gutted by inflation couldn't withstand mass depopulation. A military desperate for soldiers was ravaged by disease. These were the final, inescapable blows that ensured the once mighty Roman Empire, already stumbling, would never get back on its feet. So, was there a single reason Rome fell? No, there's no smoking gun. It was a perfect storm of 5 interconnected, fatal flaws. It began with a cancer of political corruption that paralyzed the state. That led to reckless economic policies that destroyed the currency and impoverished the people. A broken economy and unstable government could no longer support its huge army, forcing it to rely on unreliable mercenaries. That hollowed-out military was then unable to defend against the waves of migrations that broke on its frontiers. And undercutting it all, a hostile climate and devastating plagues sapped the empire of its strength, manpower, and will to survive. Each flaw fed the others, creating a feedback loop of decline that became irreversible. The fall of the Western Roman Empire wasn't the end of the world, but it was the end of a world, an age of centralized authority, continent-spanning trade, and shared culture. But the legacy of Rome endures. Its language, laws, architecture, and ideas still shape our world in countless ways. Perhaps the most important lesson from Rome's collapse is a sobering one. No empire is forever. Even the mightiest civilizations are fragile things, vulnerable not just to external enemies, but to internal decay, bad decisions, and forces of nature that we ignore at our own peril. But what do you think? Was there one flaw that outweighed the others? Was it the corrupt emperors, the economic collapse, or the barbarian migrations? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the great stories of history, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Thanks for watching.